This morning we are continuing in our series that we've called Soul Food. This is where we are looking at ways, a term for it is, I've forgotten what the term is. It's just gone out of my head. Anyway, discipleship is basically really it. How do we nurture our souls? If you've ever asked, is this it as a Christian? Is this all that there is? The answer is no. God has more for us. And we want to explore that over these weeks. How we can go deeper with God. Spiritual formation, that was the term I was looking for just now. Yeah, but discipleship isn't that a simpler, perhaps, word for it. Yeah, there's opportunities to go deeper with God in different ways, exploring new ways of getting close to Him. And so I do need to clarify the topic. It's quite a practical topic this morning, mentoring and accountability. I need to clarify that's accountability rather than accounting. I gather there was a little bit of confusion earlier in the week. Accounting would also be a useful thing to talk about, but I'm not the person to do that, as anyone who knows me would tell you. But before we get really stuck in, I want to ask a few questions of us. If you're a Christian this morning, if you look back on to what first attracted you to Christianity, what was it? Was it a talk that you heard, or was it someone or some people that you saw and that there was something about them that attracted you and made you want to know more? Put your hand up if it was like a talk. Okay. Put your hand up if it was a person that you met. Okay, yeah. And put your hand up if it was something else. Put your hand up if you never put your hand up at things, and that's why. Okay. All right, that's interesting, isn't it? Well, let's also think. Many of us have been Christians for many years, so sometimes it's hard to think back. But if you've been a committed Christian for many years, was there anyone whose example you looked to, and you saw them walking the walk, you saw that commitment, and their example was what encouraged you not just to make that initial conversion experience, but to stay in there for the long haul? Anyone recognise that? Can anyone think of somebody who did that? Put your hand up if there's somebody in your mind now that you can think of who really was instrumental and in your commitment, your ongoing walk. Great. What kind of qualities did they have? Just spend a moment thinking about that. What was it about them that struck you? For me, somebody who's had a massive input on my life, many of you would guess it's Jeff Hills. He was my youth leader. He was a church leader here for many years before he moved to Devon. He's been back to speak fairly recently. And he's a brilliant speaker. If you've heard him, you'd know that. But it wasn't his speaking. I can remember one or two of his things from his talks, but it's not that really had the impact. What I remember most from him was just his acts, just who he was. It was his generosity and selflessness to us, sometimes very annoying teenagers. And he worked for himself, and he would sometimes take us along on his jobs. He'd take us down on working parties to do things. We'd see him interacting with other people. We'd see how he worked. We'd see his heart. And he would just invest in us without counting the cost to himself. The number of meals he took us out on as a teenager, just to kind of get to know us and help us to get to know one another. And that had such an impact on me. And that's lasted my whole life so far. Can anyone else? We were talking about this at house group the other day, so it was really interesting hearing some other people's experience. But anyone else care to just shout out somebody who had an impact on them? Jeff and his brother John, yes. John too was the pastor here for many years. Did someone else say something? Yeah, agree. Yeah. Those two brothers have had a massive influence on so many people. I suspect Darren could probably name someone like Reg Reynolds or... Okay. Right. And who were they?
Right.
Who were they?
They were a couple that set up a church in a school in Hamworth, and then they moved the whole of their church to Hamworth Methodist. And again, they were selfless people that gave their lives for serving God.
Great. Well, thanks, Darren.
So,
yeah, what influential people, an influence people can have. So, when people look at church, they sometimes perhaps think of it as a building. We often say it's not just a building, but often we think of it as a building. Even if we don't think of it as a building, we may think of church as primarily an organisation that does stuff. And there's truth in that. And in recent years, a lot of churches, especially larger churches, have had a tendency to bring in business management expertise and techniques to help manage the church. And they can, useful though they are, they can end up with something that looks more like a corporation. And because it is really important to have some kind of organisation if you're a group. Otherwise nothing gets done and you're just not effective meeting together. But it's very easy for that to take over, kind of become the tail wagging the dog. And it all becomes about the building and about the programs and the money, the rotas. And we need to remind ourselves that the Bible doesn't talk about the church as an organisation, does it? It talks, or a corporation, it talks about the church as a living and interconnected body. Romans 12:5. So we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members of one another. It's like a network. I think of the roots of a tree, especially the tree that got into our drains, these little fibrous roots that send out that interconnection. That's what the church, that's a picture of the organic nature of the church. Also, God is relational. The Holy Trinity, the Godhead, is relational in itself. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit relating to one another. And he's created us to be relational as well in his image. That is part of our humanity that he's created. So this morning, we're going to think about two aspects of that relational nature that can be really helpful for us and for others, but they can quite easily get neglected or downplayed. And you know what those things are because I've shown them already. Mentoring is the first thing that I want us to think about. So mentoring, some may or may not get the picture. What is a mentor? And some of the people that we thought about earlier on, you may not have given them that label, but they actually have been mentors to us. Whether it's in a formal capacity, like a youth leader or something, or an informal one. So I've got some definitions here that I've picked up of mentoring. A wise and trusted counsellor or teacher. A mentoring is a dynamic, intentional relationship of trust in which one person, the mentor, enables another, the mentoree or mentee, I think I've also heard it called, by sharing their God-given experience and resources to maximize the grace of God in their life and in their experience. When we mentor someone, we say, you matter, Your life and your story is important. You and your life have value. So, as I said, mentoring can be a formal arrangement. Some of you may have suffered mentoring at work. Sometimes it can go well and sometimes it doesn't go so well. But it can also be a very informal relationship. And if you thought of somebody earlier who had a big influence on you, it may have been formal, like a Sunday school teacher, but it may have been informal, like a family member who may not have even considered themselves to be a mentor, but nevertheless, they had that role in your life of mentorship. Now, mentors are not smarter or more gifted than other people, but they're just a little bit further down the road and have a bit of wisdom to offer. So that's all well and good. This is all very in the zeitgeist at the moment, isn't it? Mentoring's all over the place. But is it biblical? Are there any biblical examples of mentoring? Yes, of course there are, yeah. We could look, we can't go into all these in detail. I'll leave it to you to look up these references if you want to later. But we could think about Jethro and Moses, Jethro advising Moses, Eli and Samuel. The early church leaders, if you look in all of 1 Peter 5, you can see advice for elders and deacons and the way to conduct themselves and to mentor their congregations. Jesus and his disciples, we're going to come back to that. Paul and Barnabas, and then later Paul and Timothy. And there are many other examples that we could pick from the Bible. So what about Jesus and mentoring? When you think of Jesus, probably the first word that you think of is not mentor, I would imagine. But I want to challenge that a little bit this morning. When we think of church, some of the things that may seem to us to have always been an important part of church life have actually been introduced, or at least they've risen in importance after the Bible was written, after the early church. For instance, as the church initially grew, it was strongly influenced by Greek culture and thinking, where one of the things from that is this thing of oratory. Greek orators, they were a big thing in Greek culture. And as Christianity spread, the Greek influence of oratory started to become part of the Christian experience. And as people who'd been Greek orators became Christians, that whole thing of oratory, speeches, actually gained importance and became more highly valued. And this helps to explain how the concept of the sermon, as we've known it for many hundreds of years, got to become so highly valued. In fact, the Greek orators used the term homily for their talks. And if you go to an Anglican church, that's still the term that's given to the talk, isn't it? And then in the 15th century, the printing press was invented. And suddenly, everyone got access to a copy of the Bible in their own language. And of course, the Reformation kicked off. And suddenly, the rise of personal reading of the Bible and study became super important. And a key characteristic of the Reformed Church is this focus on the Bible and your individual responsibility to read it, work out your salvation yourself. Now, preaching and teaching are a really useful and powerful thing. And it's really wonderful and valuable and important for us to be able to study the scriptures ourselves. So I am by no means saying that we should get rid of either of them or change that. But sometimes when some things have a big emphasis, there's a tendency to de-emphasize some other things. And that's what we're looking at this morning, trying to restore a little bit of balance there. So let's see let's compare this, what we've just been talking about, to how Jesus worked. That yes, he talked to the crowds, he preached, he talked to the crowds and did many other things in public, like healings, confronting the authorities. But huge amounts of his energy went into just 12 people, the disciples. Even when he'd spoken publicly to the crowd about, say, the parable of the sower or the mustard seed, it would then be his disciples that he would explain it to later and invest that time. Mark 5 says, with many similar parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as much as they could understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. But when he was alone with his disciples, his own disciples, he explained everything. That doesn't sound like our classic 3-point sermon, does it? So what did it look like? There's a writer, Tammy Heim, who I think sums it up very well. She says, Jesus had no formal school, no seminaries, no outlined course of study, no periodic membership classes in which he enrolled his followers. None of these highly organized procedures, considered so necessary today, entered his ministry. Amazing as it may seem, all Jesus did to teach these men his way was to draw them close to himself. He was his own school. If we look at the book of Mark, we can see this journey that Jesus takes with his disciples. In chapter 1, he calls those first disciples. Then they are with him as he drives out evil spirits, heals people, is confronted by the authorities, confronts the authority, undermines the authorities, deals with the adulation of crowds. And then there's a moment in chapter 3 where he officially takes these 12 that he's, the ragtag bunch, and transforms them. He says, you are now apostles. He shows them the weight of responsibility that will be on their shoulders and the trust that he's placing in them to prepare themselves to go out and emulate what they've seen him do. But he doesn't stop there. They don't just go off at that point. They continue to be with him, knowing who they now are, knowing what they've been given, as he teaches them, teaches others, confronts evil, heals people, until finally they're ready in chapter 6 to be sent out on their own to heal and to call people to repentance. But even then, he doesn't leave them there. Even after that sort of mission trip experience that they had, he's still investing in them, having them alongside him as things ramp up with the authorities. And they're arguing amongst themselves and he's putting them straight. Jesus explains, he tries to explain what's going to happen to him, but they don't understand it. And he goes to Gethsemane for this traumatic moment for him. They fall asleep when he's so distressed, and then he's arrested, and they see it all, but not from a back seat. Apart from the times where they run away or fall asleep, they're there to witness it firsthand. Not just what happened, but the way Jesus deals with it, the look on his face when he's hurt, or his anger at injustice, or his laughter. I say this because it's a million miles away from, say, listening to somebody drawl on at the front of a classroom or taking some notes from a sermon. It's a lived experience. Some people use the term praxis to describe this way of teaching through action. And I quite like Wikipedia. I don't often quote Wikipedia, but I quite like that description of the process by which a theory or a lesson or a skill is enacted, embodied, realized, applied, or put into practice. And later on we see this not just with Jesus, but in the New Testament it's reflected in the way that Barnabas mentors and champions Paul when at that point Paul was considered as potentially dangerous, dodgy new disciple that people didn't know whether to trust. Barnabas is there for him. And then when Paul spreads his wings later on, and Barnabas takes on Mark as a new mentee. And then further still, we have the book of Timothy, which is Paul's mentoring relationship with Timothy. So it's there all over the New Testament. But it doesn't stop there. It's still happening with you and me. If you're a Christian, then whenever you're with someone else, you're an example of what a Christian is like. Whether or not you're in a formal or an informal mentoring relationship, your behaviours, my behaviours and actions, your speech, all of it displays something of where you are with Jesus at the moment, for better or for worse. We can't help it. It's just a fact. And it can't help to have an effect on the people who you meet, however small, for better or for worse. We're relational creatures. One of the saddest and most distressing moments of my time as a youth leader was when we had a visit from a girl who had been attending our youth group for a few months. I can't remember how she originally found out about the group, but she'd taken the brave step of coming along on her own, even though she didn't know anyone who was in the group, and none of the other group members. One day she knocked at our door and said she wanted to let us know that she wouldn't be coming to the group anymore because she'd come to the group to find God and she hadn't found him. It's upsetting even now. And when she said that, I knew that she didn't mean that we'd not been teaching about God. We'd been doing that every week. The problem was that the group at that particular time, in that group, there was such a toxic atmosphere that there was nothing of God reflected in the group members. All they would do was take sides against each other and bicker. None of them showed an ounce of friendship to each other, and none to her. They just didn't befriend her at all. And we had let that carried on, mostly unchallenged. It was like a knife through the heart. Sorry, I wasn't this upset when I was writing it. But Ness and I, after that, we decided that we would completely rethink the way we did youth work from then on. Oh dear. Just drink some coffee. Be right. So yes, we all know that we're capable of not being very Christian or very Christ-like. But of course, our prayer is that as we walk with him and as we walk with him, people do see Jesus' qualities in us. You don't need to have a formal mentor-mentee relationship for this to work. It can happen in all our relationships, in all our interactions, with our family, with our colleagues, with our neighbours, and also, of course, at church and in our activities like Maswell at Home. Last Thursday at Maswell at Home, I was talking to someone who arrived in a real state. They'd had run-ins with a number of people beforehand and during the week, and they were pretty convinced that they were going to have a falling out with somebody that night. And As we talked, they explained some of their issues and their problems in trying to control their anger. And we were able to talk about some of the ways to cope with that. And I was able to share one thing that had helped me, which is to pray for the person that you have anger or bitterness about. Because it's really hard to feel the same way about someone for a long time when you're doing that, when you're praying for them. My sense is that it's this action of praxis, demonstrating God's love in action, showing a different way of letting God's love through us, that made a difference for her. As she left that evening, she said how I always feel different when I've been here. At the end of the evening, it changes me. I always feel different. I always feel calmer. That's praxis, part of it. So I really want to encourage you not to underestimate the effect that your behaviour and example has on the people around you. It's more powerful than anything that we can say from the front. And it's much more long-lasting. You'll have probably forgotten what I said in a couple of weeks' time. Maybe I will too. But people will remember the friendship and the investment that you've given them for perhaps their whole lives. Now, as a word of warning here, you could take that to mean, oh no, this means I have to pretend to be really spiritual and holy all the time with everyone I meet. Otherwise, I'll be letting Jesus down. But that's a hopeless case. That would just bring about guilt. This whole, I have to look like a Christian. I have to wear a holier than thou mask. That's a cause for disaster. And I can think of many times when I've pretended to be more spiritual than I really am. In fact, it's always a pressure, especially when you're up here. But it does no good to pretend to be someone you're not. And sometimes that has quite toxic results. So yes, of course, there's a call for us all to become better disciples of Jesus, yes. And that's what this whole Soul Food series is about. But we can't fake that. We just have to walk with Jesus and be as honest as we can about who we are. But perhaps if we're aware of how powerful this praxis, this mentoring, this getting alongside people and sharing ourselves with them is, we might be a little bit more intentional about it sometimes. There may be neighbours or relatives that you could invest yourself in. Perhaps your grandchild. Perhaps think about coming to Mousewell at Home if you're not involved already. And when you're there, don't just chat to all your friends from church, but make an effort to talk to new people and find out about them and love them and invest in them. That's what we're called to do. But that's a lot on accountability, on mentoring. There's another side which I think is equally important, but time is short, so I'm going to talk briefly about accountability, not accountancy. This is quite a loaded word that probably people give different meanings to. But I think this definition fits it well. An obligation or a willingness to accept responsibility or account for one's actions. So accountability is normally part of a mentoring relationship where the mentor may feel able to ask the mentee searching questions. This can be a really powerful tool in the relationship where the mentee gives the mentor permission to ask them questions that they don't really want to answer. That's a kind of one-way accountability. Another kind, though, is two-way accountability. This is where two or more people agree between them to have a relationship of accountability. They give each other permission to ask the difficult questions of each other. And if that accountability is given willingly, it can be really powerful and transformative in Christian lives. You might have a different accountability relationships for different things. If you're married, it might be appropriate for you that your spouse holds you accountable for some things, who ate all the biscuits, that sort of thing, just for example. But there might be a different relationship that you have with someone else who can hold you accountable in a different way. I once had a guy ask if he had an issue with pornography, and he asked if I could be his accountability partner in that. And there was a sort of app that he installed on his devices, and it would give a sort of report of what his viewing habits had been, and that then helped him to kind of keep that in check. But that he didn't feel that was appropriate to burden his wife with that. And related to this is confession. Now that might be something that that might be something that we tend to associate with the Catholic Church, maybe not for us. Or we think, well, that's something I do privately at home. I may confess my sins to God, and that's between me and God. And it may go against all our instincts as English people, if we're English people, that sort of reserve. There's that sometimes a reticence to say anything to someone else that's deep inside. But actually confessing to somebody can be that we trust, can be very powerful. And in fact, if you look at James 5, he says, "Therefore confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you'll be healed." I've said the church is not an organisation. Or not just an organisation, it's organic. And so we shouldn't always look to the church to fix, to create a system. There's a tendency to think, oh, well, the church will create a process or a system to make this work. Sometimes we have to work these things out for ourselves, okay? But we do have house groups. That can be a really good way to have a sense of accountability and relationship. So I really encourage you to think about joining a house group if you're not in one currently. I know there's a number of prayer triplets in the church. They're not sort of centrally organised, but maybe you could think about a prayer partner or a prayer triplet that you could be in, where you have that accountability with somebody else. For me, Ness does keep me accountable on a number of things, not just why I ate all the biscuits and cheese the other night. But I also have a friend, Neil, who is going to come and speak in a couple of weeks' time. And with him, we can talk about other things about Christian faith and can challenge one another. And that's been a very helpful relationship for me. And although we've known each other since we were teenagers, in recent years it's developed into something that looks a bit more like accountability. So what about you? Do you have somebody who holds you accountable, who you give permission to ask the difficult questions about your faith, or who you ask those awkward questions to? One of my favourite verses is Proverbs 27. Oh, that's not it. I haven't got it on the screen. Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. That's an excellent summary, I think, of how mentoring and accountability can work. How can we sharpen one another to be more Christ-like? So I hope that's given you some food for thought. So to just pull it together, I've got some thoughts and questions here. So let's remember that church is not all about the systems. It's an organism, not an organisation. It's all about relationship. And sometimes you have to be the one that initiates those relationships. Who has mentored you? Just take a moment now of gratitude and thanks. If there is somebody in your mind who has been a mentor to you. It may be that you're in a place where actually you need to be mentored. And I've been looking at, for instance, you may have heard of spiritual directors, somebody who, like a counsellor, will come and you can talk to them and they help to in spiritual growth. I keep talking about finding one of those, but I haven't actually done anything about it yet. So perhaps this talk will give me the push I need to do that. But maybe for you, you need to go to somebody and say, will you be my mentor in this aspect of my life? Don't underestimate the power that you have to have a positive influence around you just by staying close to Jesus and then being alongside people. Who could you invest yourself in and help to grow? Just take a moment, close your eyes perhaps just for 10 seconds and think about that. Whatever age you are, it makes no difference. There is someone. Who could you develop an accountability relationships with to help each other grow, like as peer to peer? Perhaps in the form of a house group or a prayer triplet or prayer pair. And let's finish by thinking about Hebrews 10:24, another of my favourite scriptures. Let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord God, that you didn't make us as machines or the church as a corporation, but as a living, breathing body, reflecting you in our actions and our relationships. Help us to reflect you in all that we do, to be intentional about those who we can come alongside and encourage. Help me to consider who I can be accountable with, sharing, encouraging, confessing, challenging, and investing in one another. And help me to follow the Master, Jesus, ever more closely. Amen.